March 1945. Before dawn, the Rhine moves silently through the cold air of Western Germany. Its surface is dark, heavy and fast, swollen with winter meltwater. Fog drifts low across the river, blurring the opposite bank into a grey, uncertain line. Where bridges once stood, there is only twisted steel. Concrete pylons rise from the water like broken teeth. Charges placed by retreating German engineers have done their work thoroughly. On the western bank, American soldiers wait in silence. Infantrymen clutch rifles with numb hands. Engineers crouch beside stacks of steel pontoons, Bailey Bridge sections, and assault boats, already marked with mud and frost. No speeches are given. There is no ceremony. The Rhine has been called uncrossable for generations, a natural fortress, wide and unforgiving, now reinforced by demolition and desperation. Across the river lies the German heartland. Behind it, the last intact rail lines, factories, and command centers of the Third Reich. For months, German planners believed this river would buy them time. Days, weeks, perhaps. Instead, the first hammers are lifted before sunrise. And with that quiet preparation, the final barrier to Germany begins to disappear, piece by piece, leading directly into the forces and decisions that brought this moment into being. The Rhine as Hitler's last line. By the autumn of 1944, the geography of Germany itself had become a weapon. No river carried more political, cultural, or military weight than the Rhine. Flowing from the Swiss Alps to the North Sea, it cut a natural defensive trench across Western Germany, wide, fast-moving, and historically difficult to cross under fire. For centuries, armies had planned around it. Now it stood as the Third Reich's final natural barrier against invasion. After the Allied breakout from Normandy in August 1944, American, British, and Canadian forces advanced rapidly across France and Belgium. German units, battered and retreating, fell back toward their own borders. By September, Allied troops reached the Siegfried Line, Germany's pre-war system of bunkers, dragon's teeth, and fortified zones. Though formidable on paper, the line was undermanned, poorly supplied, and increasingly irrelevant in the face of Allied air superiority and artillery. Adolf Hitler and the German High Command fixated on the Rhine as the point where the Western Allies could finally be stopped. Orders issued in late 1944 were explicit. Every bridge over the river was to be prepared for demolition. Civilian traffic was restricted. Military engineers placed explosives into piers and roadbeds. The goal was not subtle defense, but absolute denial. If the Allies could not cross quickly, German forces hoped to regroup, redeploy reserves, and perhaps force a negotiated peace in the West. This belief persisted even as Germany's situation deteriorated. The Ardennes offensive in December 1944, the Battle of the Bulge, was a last attempt to regain the initiative. When it failed, German losses were irreplaceable. Entire armored divisions were destroyed. Fuel reserves vanished. Trained pilots and crews were gone. Yet even after this defeat, the Rhine remained psychologically intact. As long as it held, Germany could still imagine resistance. On the Allied side, planning never relied on hope. Supreme Headquarters Allied Expeditionary Force, under General Dwight D. Eisenhower, understood that a deliberate Rhine crossing would normally require months of preparation. In previous wars, such operations had involved prolonged bombardments, carefully staged bridge construction, and enormous casualties. But time was now the most precious resource. The Red Army was advancing rapidly from the east. The race toward the center of Germany had begun. American commanders, particularly in the U.S. 1st and 9th Armies, began preparing for multiple crossing scenarios: assault crossings, emergency bridging, and rapid exploitation beyond the river. Engineer units trained continuously, assembling and disassembling pontoon bridges under simulated fire. Bailey Bridge components were stockpiled close to the front. Every unit understood its role, even if the exact location of the crossing was still unknown. German planners assumed they could control the timetable by destroying the bridges. They did not fully account for the speed, flexibility, and industrial scale that followed the American armies toward the Rhine, a momentum that was already reshaping the battlefield long before the river itself came into view. The stage was set for a confrontation not just between armies, but between expectations, and that confrontation would deepen as Allied forces closed in from every direction. Allied momentum and German desperation. By early 1945, the war in Western Europe had entered a new phase, one defined by speed, exhaustion, and inevitability. The failed German offensive in the Ardennes had not only cost men and equipment, it had shattered the last illusion of strategic control. German divisions pulled back toward the Rhine in fragments. Some units retreated in formation. Others dissolved into columns of stragglers moving through bombed roads and frozen fields. The Allied advance resumed with relentless pressure. In February 1945, Operation Veritable and Operation Grenade pushed British, Canadian, and American forces through the Rhineland. Towns fell in rapid succession. Artillery and air power crushed resistance before it could consolidate. The Luftwaffe, once a dominant force, appeared only in scattered, ineffective sorties. Allied fighter bombers ruled the sky, striking bridges, rail yards, and troop concentrations daily. For German commanders, the Rhine was no longer simply a defensive line, it was a deadline. Orders from Berlin emphasized one instruction above all others: delay the enemy. Bridges were to be destroyed at the last possible moment, allowing German units to escape eastward while denying the Allies a ready crossing. This policy required precise timing, discipline, and functioning command structures, conditions that were increasingly absent. Civilian life along the Rhine collapsed into chaos. Refugees flooded eastward, sharing roads with retreating troops and horse-drawn supply wagons. Engineers raced against advancing Allied spearheads to wire bridge charges before being cut off. In several cases, demolition crews arrived only hours before American armor reached the riverbanks. Mistakes were common. Communications failed. Some bridges were destroyed too early, trapping German units on the western bank. Others were destroyed too late, or not at all. On the Allied side, commanders adapted rapidly to opportunity. While large-scale Rhine crossings were planned for late March under Operation Plunder, field commanders were instructed to exploit any unexpected opening. Speed was essential. If a bridge could be seized intact, or even partially usable, it could collapse the entire German defensive concept overnight. This approach placed extraordinary pressure on frontline units. Infantry and armor were ordered to advance aggressively, often with limited rest. Engineer battalions moved close behind combat troops, sometimes under direct fire. Equipment was preloaded. Bridge components were marked, staged, and ready for immediate assembly. Training emphasized improvisation, crossings under smoke, night construction, and rapid repair of damaged spans. German intelligence underestimated this flexibility. The assumption remained that no army could cross the Rhine in strength without weeks of preparation. History supported that belief, but history did not account for an industrialized war fought by units capable of building heavy bridges in hours rather than weeks. By the time American forces reached the river in multiple sectors, the Germans had successfully destroyed most crossings. To Berlin, this looked like success. To Allied commanders, it looked like an invitation, because the absence of bridges did not mean the absence of crossings. And as both sides stared across the wide, cold water, the conflict shifted from strategy to execution, from plans on paper to decisions made under fire, opening the way to the many human and mechanical forces that would define the crossing itself. Human resolve, tactical pressure, and engineering precision. For the American soldier on the Rhine, the river was not an abstract objective. It was cold water moving faster than expected. It was the weight of equipment dragging at frozen boots. Infantry units tasked with securing bridgeheads understood their role with stark clarity. Engineers could not work until someone stood on the far bank. Riflemen crossed first, often in fragile assault boats, exposed to machine gun fire and artillery bursts that shattered the water's surface. Fear was present, but routine had replaced panic. By 1945, these men had crossed beaches, rivers, and towns under fire. The Rhine was larger, but it was still a river, and rivers could be crossed. American doctrine emphasized momentum. Commanders accepted risk to maintain pressure. Rather than waiting for ideal conditions, crossings were executed under smoke screens, at night, or in poor weather. Artillery units provided continuous suppressive fire. Engineers worked with infantry cover measured in yards, not miles. Tactical success depended on timing. The faster a bridge could be emplaced, the less time German artillery had to respond. In this environment, speed became protection. The U.S. Army Engineer Corps represented the industrial strength of the United States translated directly onto the battlefield. Bailey bridges, modular steel truss systems, could be assembled by hand without heavy machinery. Pontoon bridges floated on steel or rubber pontoons, anchored against strong currents. Units practiced building under fire, in darkness, and with damaged components. Repair teams stood ready as soon as bridges were hit. If one span collapsed, another could be launched beside it within hours. The river was no longer a fixed obstacle, it was a technical problem with multiple solutions. Together, these forces, human endurance, tactical urgency, and engineering capability, began to erode the German assumption that destruction equaled denial. Yet the story of the Rhine was not shaped by American strength alone. On the opposite bank, German decisions, shortages, and morale played an equally critical role, shaping the outcome in ways that only became visible as the crossings multiplied. Leadership, enemy perspective, and moral collapse. At every level, Allied leadership emphasized decentralization. Field commanders were encouraged to exploit success without waiting for permission from higher headquarters. This philosophy allowed rapid decisions at the riverbank. When opportunities appeared, damaged bridges, lightly defended sectors, confused German withdrawals, local commanders acted immediately. Engineer officers coordinated directly with infantry and armor, bypassing layers of bureaucracy. The Rhine crossings were not directed by a single dramatic order, but by dozens of synchronized decisions made within minutes of opportunity presenting itself. From the German perspective, the Rhine was meant to reset the battlefield. Yet by early 1945, the Wehrmacht lacked the resources to defend it effectively. Artillery ammunition was scarce. Anti-aircraft guns were increasingly used in ground roles, often without adequate training. Command posts were frequently overrun or cut off. German units were ordered to hold ground without the means to do so. Worse, the assumption that the river alone could compensate for these weaknesses proved fatal. Demolished bridges delayed movement, but they did not prevent it. For German soldiers, the destruction of their own infrastructure carried a psychological cost. Bridges were symbols of connection, commerce, and home. Watching them collapse under demolition charges was a visual admission that the war was coming to German soil and would not be stopped. For Allied troops, each completed crossing carried the opposite meaning. Every span assembled under fire was proof that the end was approaching. Morale rose not through speeches, but through tangible progress. Boots on the east bank, vehicles rolling across steel laid hours before. By March 1945, the river had become less a boundary and more a corridor. Each successful crossing weakened German resistance elsewhere. The psychological effect traveled faster than the armies themselves. News spread rapidly, bridges were being built, the Rhine was being crossed, the line was broken. And as these angles converged, leadership, enemy miscalculation, and moral momentum, the war approached a decisive moment, one defined not by planning alone, but by execution under extraordinary pressure. When the Rhine gave way, the decisive moment did not begin with a grand offensive. It began with surprise. On March 7, 1945, elements of the U.S. First Army approached the town of Remagen. Intelligence reports suggested that the Ludendorff Bridge, one of the last intact crossings over the Rhine, was prepared for demolition. German engineers had wired it with explosives. Orders were clear: destroy the bridge before it could fall into enemy hands. But war rarely unfolds exactly as planned. As American armor and infantry advanced toward the river, they discovered the bridge still standing. Smoke rose from nearby demolitions. German troops on the eastern bank hesitated, uncertain whether to trigger the charges. When the explosives were finally detonated, they failed to fully destroy the structure. The bridge shuddered, cracked, and partially collapsed, but it remained standing. Within minutes, U.S. commanders grasped the significance. There was no time to wait. Infantry units were ordered forward immediately. Under machine gun fire and artillery bursts, American soldiers sprinted across the damaged span. engineers followed, carrying tools and explosives of their own, not to destroy, but to reinforce. Cracks were stabilized, loose planks were replaced, the bridge was held. The capture of the Ludendorff Bridge sent shockwaves through both commands. For the Germans, it was a catastrophe. Hitler ordered court-martials and executions for officers deemed responsible. For the Allies, it was an opportunity beyond expectation. Reinforcements poured across the river. Anti-aircraft guns were brought forward to defend the bridge against air attack. German attempts to destroy it, from artillery, aircraft, and even frogmen, continued relentlessly. Yet the significance of Remagen extended beyond a single bridge. It shattered the psychological certainty that the Rhine could not be crossed intact. Even as engineers worked to keep the damaged bridge standing, other units prepared crossings elsewhere, this time without relying on chance. The race was no longer to reach the river. It was to get across it everywhere at once. Overnight bridges and the collapse of the barrier. With Remagen secured, American commanders accelerated every existing plan. The unexpected bridgehead east of the Rhine forced a shift from caution to exploitation. While German forces concentrated fire on the damaged Ludendorff Bridge, U.S. engineers moved to create alternatives, knowing the bridge's days were numbered. South and north of Remagen, engineer battalions worked through the night. Under artillery fire and drifting smoke, pontoon bridges were launched section by section. Boats were ferried across in steady cycles, carrying infantry, artillery, and vehicles. Heavy equipment followed on steel floats that rose and fell with the river's current. Searchlights reflected off low clouds, creating artificial moonlight to illuminate the work. Every minute counted. On March 10, just 3 days after its capture, the Ludendorff Bridge finally collapsed into the Rhine. By then, it no longer mattered. Multiple pontoon bridges were already operational nearby. Thousands of troops and hundreds of vehicles had crossed. What German planners feared most, an uncontrolled Allied breakout, was already underway. Farther north, on the night of March 23-24, Operation Plunder commenced. British, Canadian, and American forces launched coordinated assault crossings supported by massive artillery barrages and airborne landings. The scale was overwhelming. Smoke screens stretched for miles. Engineer units assembled bridges at speeds previously considered impossible. Some spans capable of carrying tanks were completed in less than a day. German resistance fragmented rapidly. Without bridges of their own, German units struggled to redeploy or retreat. Command and control broke down. Isolated pockets of resistance were bypassed. The Rhine, once a wall, had become a funnel, channeling Allied forces deep into Germany. The crossings marked more than a tactical success. They ended any realistic German hope of stabilizing the Western Front. From this point forward, Allied armies moved with unprecedented freedom of movement. Logistics followed seamlessly. The industrial capacity of the Allies now flowed unimpeded across Germany's greatest natural defense. As the bridgeheads expanded and armored columns pushed eastward, the consequences of crossing the Rhine became impossible to ignore, reshaping the final weeks of the war and sealing the fate of the Third Reich. Immediate military consequences. The capture of intact crossings over the Rhine and the rapid construction of new bridges transformed the operational landscape of Western Europe. The U.S. 1st and 9th Armies could pour troops, armor, and supplies into the German heartland without delay. Infantry divisions that would have taken days to ferry across rivers were now moving simultaneously in multiple sectors. The pace of the Allied advance accelerated sharply, overwhelming any remaining organized German defenses. The collapse of the Rhine's defensive function forced German commanders into reactive strategies. Artillery units were redeployed to try to interdict bridgeheads, but shortages of ammunition and fuel limited effectiveness. Panzer divisions, meant to counterattack Allied crossings, arrived piecemeal and were often intercepted before reaching their objectives. Entire units found themselves stranded on the wrong side of the river due to demolished bridges or impassable terrain. The psychological impact of seeing Americans on the eastern bank while their own defenses crumbled cannot be overstated. Engineering units became the backbone of operational momentum. The US Army's rapid bridging and river crossing capabilities allowed them to outpace German predictions. Where Hitler believed days or even weeks would be needed to regroup, Allied forces were already deep inside Western Germany. Supplies, vehicles, and reinforcements crossed in continuous waves, reducing the time German forces had to mount any countermeasures. Even small tactical successes compounded into strategic advantages. The seizure of towns like Remagen provided staging areas for further crossings. Artillery positions could be emplaced east of the Rhine in record time. Armored units moved rapidly to exploit breaches. German defensive lines collapsed faster than they could be reconstructed, rendering the Rhine an obstacle in name only. The immediate effect was clear. What was meant to be a natural fortress had become a conduit for defeat. The Allies' ability to convert rapid crossings into sustained operations forced Germany into a continuous retreat. Commanders who had relied on geography now faced the harsh reality that industrial ingenuity, human resilience, and tactical daring could render even the most formidable natural barriers irrelevant. Strategic and psychological impact on Germany. The crossings of the Rhine did more than open a path into Germany. They shattered the German army's confidence and morale. For months, the river had symbolized the final defensive line. Its destruction, or more precisely, its neutralization, signaled that no natural barrier could halt the Allied advance. Commanders in Berlin recognized the collapse immediately. Orders became frantic, contradictory, and often impossible to execute. Units were caught in transit, supply lines disrupted, and communication networks fragmented. The psychological toll on German troops was profound. Soldiers who had spent years defending the Rhine now faced an unthinkable reality. The Allies were already moving into the heartland. Retreating units encountered newly constructed bridges behind them, severing any hope of organized fallback. Panic and confusion spread faster than combat. Desertions increased. The collapse of the Rhine as a defensive anchor accelerated the disintegration of the Western Front, leaving the Third Reich increasingly vulnerable. Strategically, the Rhine crossings allowed the Allies to envelop the Ruhr industrial region, the heart of German production. Armored columns, infantry, and supply convoys moved swiftly, cutting off retreat routes and isolating German formations. This rapid advance prevented the regrouping of reserves and denied the Wehrmacht any opportunity to establish a coherent defense. The operational tempo set by the Rhine crossings forced Germany into a reactive posture, unable to regain initiative. International observers and military analysts noted the unprecedented speed at which an army could neutralize natural obstacles with engineering prowess. Reports emphasized the coordination of infantry, armor, and engineering units. The success of the Rhine crossings became a case study in modern combined arms operations and demonstrated how logistical planning and technological application could decisively overcome what was once considered impassable terrain. By the end of March 1945, the Rhine no longer served as Germany's protective barrier. Its symbolic power had collapsed alongside the physical defenses, accelerating the end of the war in Western Europe. Allied forces pressed eastward, empowered not only by victory, but by the knowledge that no natural feature, no matter how formidable, could stop their momentum. The Rhine crossing and its lasting significance. The Rhine, long a symbol of natural strength and national identity, had proven vulnerable not to overwhelming force alone, but to ingenuity, coordination, and human determination. What was once considered uncrossable became, in a matter of days, a corridor for an unstoppable advance. The combination of engineering skill, tactical audacity, and relentless momentum reshaped how armies approached natural barriers in modern warfare. For history, the Rhine crossings underscored a fundamental truth. Preparation, speed, and adaptability can render the seemingly impossible achievable. The engineers who worked through the night, the infantry who secured riverbanks under fire, and the commanders who seized fleeting opportunities exemplified a form of warfare where human resolve complemented technological capability. The river itself did not decide the outcome, people did. Beyond the immediate military impact, the crossings had psychological resonance. For German soldiers and civilians, the collapse of the Rhine's defenses signaled that the end was unavoidable. For the Allies, it reinforced the value of coordinated planning, rapid improvisation, and confidence in the capabilities of trained units. The lessons learned here influenced military doctrine, bridging operations, and combat engineering for decades to come. The Rhine, majestic and ancient, had borne witness to centuries of conflict. Yet in those critical days of March 1945, it became a testament not to power, but to adaptability, courage, and the relentless pursuit of opportunity. The river that had once protected a nation now stood as a silent witness to its undoing, and a reminder that history is shaped not only by geography, but by those bold enough to challenge its limits. With the Rhine behind them, the Allies pressed onward into Germany's heart, their momentum unstoppable, their resolve unshaken, a fitting end to one of the most remarkable feats of engineering and coordination in modern military history.